Hi, and this is Redline TV, and today we're going to look at the very interesting, well, more than interesting, I'm really quite excited about what's happening in Tower Hamlets and other areas. And we've got, and I must just check that I hate this bit because I always think I'm going to get people's names wrong, because I usually do in real life. Dr. Ashok Kumar, who's a senior lecturer of political economy at Birkbeck, but really importantly for this, he's an involved and active Tower Hamlets resident. And to ask the questions majorly is going to be Graham Bash from Redline TV. Okay, Graham, Ashok.
Hi, Ashok. I think one thing that's quite gone under the radar has been the significance of events in Tower Hamlets. It was in May 2022 that Lutfur won the mayoralty election by a considerable margin, and Aspire, his party, won the majority of seats, and yet it doesn't really seem to have hit the headlines. And I think what our viewers would like to know is a bit about the history, which makes it all the more remarkable, and some of Lutfur's achievements before we talk more about its significance in a broader sense.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks, Jackie. I think, firstly, just so people who might not know, Tower Hamlets is a inner London borough. It's one of the most dense areas in the country, and it's historically been quite politically radical. You know, they elected communists here. They've, of course, Bethnal Green and Bow, one of the two MP constituencies of Tower Hamlets, elected George Galloway on an anti-war ticket against Una King in the early 2000s. And it's always kind of been a bit of a radical edge. Obviously, Cable Street is located in Tower Hamlets, and it's kind of there's a kind of both in its proximity to the city of London, and the center of London, and its high density of working class people and migrant communities has always had this kind of weird juxtaposition in which they've had places like Canary Wharf, for example, which is very famous and very kind of highly with high finance capital circulation, is located in Tower Hamlets. So you have one of the poorest areas in the country, sitting right next to Canary Wharf, and right on the border of the City of London, which is obviously a center of finance, global finance. So that notwithstanding, what you saw in the sort of 2000s is after George Galloway wins that election against Una King with the Respect Party against the sitting Labour MP, you see the Labour Party really trying to take full control. They felt like they'd lost control of Tower Hamlets, and this isn't something particular to Tower Hamlets. They want control of all of the areas, particularly migrant areas, that they say, okay, this is going to be sort of like an outpost where we control it with our people, and they just ensure that they can churn out a number of votes and secure our MPs and our elected officials. But here that was thrown into sort of disarray. And so in Tower Hamlets, there wasn't really a right in the early 2000s, and 2008, 2009, and when Galloway stepped down in 2010, there was the left, which was represented by sort of independent parties and independent politics, and the Respect Party, and then you had the right, which is the Labour Party, and so within that context, Lutfur Rahman, who was the leader of the council, was a member of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party at that point, under his kind of leadership, had instituted a number of progressive changes. They had introduced the living wage, introduced a number of different social programs, which weren't radical in any sense of the term. They were kind of like left brown type of reforms. But in that context, you saw the Labour Party, really see him as not completely within the mold. He was seen as a little bit of a maverick. And so they decided to, and you have to take it into context at the time, and still now, at the time it was 32% Bengali people from Bangladesh, or descendants of people from Bangladesh, and now it's 31%. So there's a very high proportion of Bengali voters. and in the South Asian context, I mean, of course, we look at leaders in this country and we go, oh God, South Asians, they might have certain kinds of politics. No, we have to sort of depoliticize, let's say, the context of South Asia. If you go South India, it's very left-wing voters. We're talking like 99% supported. I mean, this is how I'll measure whether someone's left-wing or not. What proportion supported Corbyn or not. South Indians about 98%, Bengalis about 97%, Punjabis 92%. But then you go to like Gujarati descendants who come from North London, the numbers plummet quite significantly. So historically, quite a left-wing base of voters in general. Anyways, and he gets unceremoniously kicked out of the Labour Party under, actually, they say that he's an Islamist. You don't really hear much of that now, but that was what they used as the mechanism to sort of drive him out of the party. And there was really no questions asked because Tower Hamlets was always presented as this kind of murky political terrain where Islamists were everywhere and they didn't really have to explain themselves. And the way they explained themselves is they said that he was associated with this kind of obscure party that took a position during the 1971 Bangladesh war, which is a party that like Sadiq Khan and much of the Labour Party, a group that much of the Labour Party associate with. It wasn't it was very, very dubious, obviously, and it was untrue, obviously, and very racist, Islamophobic. Anyways, they then install John Biggs, a completely chauvinistic and well-known reactionary, to be the Labour candidate. And so Lutfur runs as an independent under the banner of Tower Hamlets First, a separate party, and to everyone's shock, wins. Everyone's shocked outside of Tower Hamlets. And so and it wasn't just Bengalis, obviously. It was like, 31%, 9% Somali, and then a proportion of other people. It was a coalition of people, but it was obviously primarily Bengali voters. So then comes in, he introduces a raft of reforms that we don't hear much about. Built the most council housing in the country, made it illegal to contract with companies that blacklisted trade unionists, introduced education maintenance allowance for everyone universally. Once the government abolished the program, this was giving every person, sort of working class kids, money every week if they go to classes. Universal university grants for all students who went to university. First in the country, first with EMA in the country. Introduced universal school meal program, first in the country. I mean, it was just, also universal elder care, first in the country. Now, everybody would point out to and say, oh, even people on the left would call him some ethno-clientelist. Again, very racist. I'm not quick to the gun about racism, but he's so clearly racist, right? Like, he's winning and very popular, so they're like, oh, it must be some kind of ethno-clientelist. But if you look at elder care, which he introduced universally, 70% of the elder care was taken up by white people. It wasn't taken up by Black people and Asians because, I mean, usually the children of Black and Asian people took care of their elderly. I'm not saying all white people don't take care of their elderly. I'm just saying of the take of the universal program was by the white English people who lived in Tower Hamlets. But he didn't care. It wasn't about, rewarding his friends and not rewarding I mean, it was nothing like that. But that's the way it was presented, despite the evidence. And also, it was a dramatic lurch away from new labor-oriented means testing that created a culture that said, if you're poor, you're undeserving and you're parasitic, that you're a scrounger. Said was, no, this is what Andre Gorz, Trotskyist from the 1960s, calls a non-reformist reform. He was trying to reform things at the level of hegemony. He was saying, no, everyone deserves these programs. And that's what makes it impossible or very difficult for a reactionary party like the Labour Party to come in and then get rid of it. Because if everyone's benefiting from it, it becomes much more difficult to marginalize. But if it's just a small section of the most working class people and poor people that get it, it's easy to just marginalize it even further. And also use it discursively as a tool of marginalization. Anyways, I digress. So by 2000, so they're doing this kind of ongoing Islamophobia campaign, but it's not really sticking to the same level, right? So they're like, okay, what can we do? So then they start constructing this idea that he's a clientelist, that he's a patronage networks, that it was, all of this completely unsubstantiated claims. The same journalists that drove the Trojan horse affair in Birmingham, the same exact ones were driving the ones against Lutfur. And so then they start doing this program of that he's this corrupt mayor. Nobody had made that claim. Until 2012, nobody had ever called him corrupt. Even his enemies would say, he's an Islamist, but he's a very honest Islamist. And they would never make those claims. And then all of a sudden, out of thin air, Islamism off the agenda, corruption. He's a corrupt guy. Anything to say that he was corrupt. Fast forward 2014, election happens. He obviously dominates. He, wins a number of council seats. And I mean, again, the Labour Party's in disarray. What do we do? Again, despite the media, despite all of the kind of slander that they dragged his name through, he still won. And, Dispatches did an entire documentary about him, and it was all lies. And there was no accountability. So what do? They go, okay, what other institutions do we have power over? We don't have power over people. So they go to the courts, and they take him to court, and it was a civil court. This guy, Judge Maury, who in 2020, by the way, said that actually Trump should have won the election. So that just tells you what his politics are. Decides using updated laws like undue spiritual influence, which hasn't been used since the 1860s during the British occupation of Ireland, which they used against Catholic priests to say these people are influencing the public in undue spiritual influence. So they're like, oh, these imams are influencing the public by saying that if you don't vote for Lutfur Rahman, you're going to go to hell or something. It's like the Labour Party is so rich. They haven't used religious institutions to institute some of the most bourgeois politics in this country. But put that to one side. It was like they then revived this politics. They also said the fact that John Biggs, again, such a reactionary, the number of reactionary and racist things that he said that there's something about Muslims and Bengalis that make them undemocratic, authoritarian. I mean, he's a vile human being. And Lutfur never even called it racist. He said this could be racially insensitive. He's such a kind and generous man. I don't have that kind of patience. And so they took him in the court case. They said that the fact that he said it was racially insensitive was a way of another form of electioneering or whatever. And then there was another claim about giving curry to volunteers. Oh, you paid people off with curry. You guys, I mean, British people give, I don't know what British food is, potatoes and fries or whatever to their volunteers. South Asians, we give curry to volunteers.
They gave curry.
You gave curry to volunteers. And it's like, oh my God, you're buying votes with curry. It's like the levels of racism through everything was so blatant. It's like they weren't even trying to hide it. It's actually unconscionable when I think about it. It makes my blood boil. But anyways, so they, based on a civil case, wasn't a criminal case, they then ban him. They kick him out and they ban him for 5 years. And they tried to break him, actually. They tried to break him and they almost did. And then in 2020, they tried to get rid of the position of mayor in Tower Hamlets. So why did they try to get rid of the position of mayor in Tower Hamlets? Because they're like, if we can't control it, we're going to abolish it. And so they do a referendum, 2020 or 2021, to say, should we abolish the mayor seat? Every single political party, Lib Dems, Tories, Labour Party, everyone that has any presence here, says is backing yes. The only one who's not backing it are people around Lutfur and people who want some semblance of democracy and accountability. And we win with 78%. So we voted not to abolish it. Obviously, they freak out. They run John Biggs. They sort of revive John Biggs, who's never been elected, by the way. He's been anointed. He has never been elected. He has no mandate whatsoever. Sort of revive the corpse of John Biggs. They reanimate him, and then they run him again. Not only does Lutfur win with a bigger majority, with a bigger coalition of people, with a bigger proportion of English white people voting for him, he takes over the council for the first time in 60 years. It was like he turned what was already a sort of creaking Labour Party, he reduced it to dust. So and now there's been a series of reforms since he's come to power. We've taken over Tower Hamlets Homes, which is the the sort of is the sort of private institution that was privatized basically to run the council house program, 23,000 council houses and properties. We took over all the leisure centers, so brought them all in-house. We're going to recognize the union. Historically, these leisure centers and private companies would break unions. We want to build up the power of trade unions, and also expanded the school meal programs out of primary schools, universal program, to the first in the country to do secondary school meal programs, because now Lutfur Sadiq Khan has expanded across the city. It started in Tower Hamlets, expanded primary school, universal school meal programs. This has now been expanded to secondary schools. And there's a lot of other reforms along the way. We want to build 4,000 new homes, 1,000 each year, council houses, social houses. Also, if you have an empty property, we're doubling, tripling, and quadrupling the council tax on that to raise more funds and to force people to rent it out if not leave it empty. We want to seize empty properties if they've been empty long enough, which is an authority that hasn't been exploited enough, and Lutfur is looking at doing that. And so there's a number of different reforms that have not only just been introduced, but also are in the works. And it's an exciting time to live in Tower Hamlets.
That sounds really great. I mean, I think he should run for Prime Minister. I'd vote for him. Anyway, Graham, you want to ask a question?
Just a couple, some follow-ups. Could you say a little bit more about the Aspire Party? Because it wasn't just Lutfur that won the mayoralty. It was the Aspire Party that won, as I understand it, just confirm please, a majority of the seats on the council. But secondly, to point out that all this happened 18 months ago, and since then there's been real developments. With the situation in Gaza, there's 60 odd Muslim councillors have resigned from the Labour Party. Labour's lost control, I think, of 3 councils as a result. Is that right? So, I mean, this is a really ongoing situation. And I suppose the thing that occurs to me is this part of something much broader, or is it something which will go back to Labour at the time of the general election? Because remember, in the mayoral election 22 in Tower Hamlets, I mean, the Muslim or the Bangladeshi vote didn't just go to Lutfur, and there was still residual, some more than residual support still for Labour. It wasn't a total annihilation in the mayoral election. And then we've got the Newham situation. I don't know if you saw it this morning. I think the Independents won a seat there as well, and that's the second one. So I'm just wondering, what's the kind of, let's generalize? Is there a generalization we can make, or is this Tower Hamlets centric?
Well, look, I can say that, okay, to the first point, what was Tower Hamlets first becomes Aspire, and Aspire is the party that Lutfur runs on, and which has a majority on the council. And in Tower Hamlets, the Labour Party is a particularly insidious organization in Tower Hamlets. It's like, really, you think it's like you go really, really, really low into like the cavern that is the Labour Party, and then you have to go a little bit lower, and then you reach the Tower Hamlets Labour Party. And the Tower Hamlets Labour Party is that precisely because there isn't an alternative to it that is a viable alternative. And if you choose in that viable alternative to continue with the deeply craven Tower Hamlets Labour Party, then it's a particularly, deadly mix. But I would say that, you had one councillor who's resigned from the Labour Party from Tower Hamlets so far, and you have all of the Tower Hamlets Labour Party councillors saying, "Oh, pro ceasefire, blah blah," because they don't believe in anything, but they want to keep their seats, but which is fine. I'm okay with that. But you obviously have the 2 MPs, Afsana Begum, who's been very vocal and criticizing not only Israel consistently, but also in supporting a ceasefire. But on the other end, you have Rushanara Ali, which really, I think she represents, sort of crystallizes some of the worst kinds of careerism that you could imagine. Because some people are ideologues. Some people are sort of like, war hawks. They believe in war. I mean, but she doesn't believe in anything. She believes in her career. So, when we were protesting her, she came out twice and said, "Oh yes, of course I'll support a ceasefire." But at some point, the Labour Party was like, "You're Muslim. Muslims are abandoning us, left, right, and center. You're leading Labour MP leading. I mean, she's spoken like 3 times in Parliament last year. But you're someone who's Muslim, who's a front bencher. If you resign, it'll hurt us even more. So if you keep your seat, if you stay and you don't call for a ceasefire, you abstain on that vote, and you somehow manage to keep your seat, she's not going to keep her seat. Then we're going to put you right in the front."
Yeah.
She made, and that was offered to her, and she said, "Okay, I'll do this," because I think at some level she's calculating, okay, fact ran the weak candidate after Galloway, and she won, and then she sort of built an establishment. She kisses all the babies, knows all the uncles' names. She goes she goes to all the events. She does all the constituency work, but that's not going to save her. It's not going to save her here. So passions are very high on this question. It's not a marginal question. It is the question in Tower Hamlets. So I think on that question, the possibilities are opened up. I think in Newham, the possibilities open. Last week, you had a second independent win in that seat, a high Bengali population. I think there's possibilities in Leicester, where the Labour Party is running an MP who lives in London, who's a very pro-Hindutva man. And I think considering what's happened in Leicester, to run someone like that is a complete abdication of any responsibility towards harmony. And so they should definitely people should definitely run someone against him. And places like Bradford and Birmingham. I'm saying in these areas, I can speak with some confidence that there is potential. Again, I will say this. I am not speaking for Aspire. Aspire, it has many different political kind of threads. There are Marxists like myself, and then there's sort of more petty bourgeois elements who are also they're very left-wing on the international question, but also there are certain kind of class interests that don't necessarily collide with this. That's sort of similar things that exist in respect, I would say. And so, I'm not speaking for anything, but there are elements, I would say, that are pushing for some kind of strategy where seats that are a Newham seat, an Aspire runs Newham, Bethnal Green and Bow. Of course not if Afsana's is run and isn't pushed out of the Labour Party. Of course, we'd never run someone against Afsana. And then maybe in somewhere like Leicester and Bradford as a kind of beachhead potential.
I mean, I find this all really exciting, I have to say, and I'd like to ask you really more about this, this feeling in terms of those communities with what's going on in Gaza and Palestine, because I kind of feel, Lewisham is a very, very different place. And I know that, when I go across the border, when I go over there, and I did recently with my grandchildren, and I could see lots and lots of Palestinian flags up and lots of sign of where the people were feeling. I think in my road, I'm kind of the only person with a Palestinian flag up, but like 2 doors down, this guy came and said to me that he does it, but he's a bit worried about putting a Palestinian flag up. My postman came and he said, "Thank you very much for doing that. Aren't you brave?" I mean, I think this is something that is really galvanizing the left in a way we haven't actually seen since Corbyn. And what do you think are the opportunities on building on this to have some kind of unity across the sectors, if you know what I mean, to build into what will obviously be quite an interesting election campaign next year? What do you think the chances are of this still being a live sort of issue and a good foundation for building that kind of power dynamic?
Yeah, I think the thing about international solidarity is that this kind of international solidarity in the sense of like standing up with the oppressed is that it is an essential ingredient, obviously, in traditional socialist politics. It has to exist there. And if it doesn't exist there, it's basically reactionary politics. It's like, oh, we want the benefits of imperialism distributed amongst the labor aristocracy, something like that. Whereas but at the other end of the question, you might have people who really anti-war and anti-imperialists who might have somewhat sort of bourgeois politics when it comes to national questions. And the point is that Palestine historically has been the space in which those contradictions and tensions can be put aside for a moment on the crucial question of fighting over Palestine. The question of longevity then becomes the question. And so when it comes to longevity, there has to be a mechanism, and typically that's crystallized in a political party. I think that's a really important question. I think these places need to be organized not simply through campaigns. Campaigns have to crystallize into a political party. Political parties, and this is, I would say, one of the criticisms of not Corbyn, but Corbynism, Corbyn's rise to power, despite there being any kind of real mass movement, also led to the fact that it sort of went up like a rocket and came down like a stick. You know, it's like when it collapsed, there wasn't much infrastructure there to allow for something that sustained and let it go. So this is the right direction of travel. You have a mass movement, you have hundreds of thousands of people, 1 million people in the streets. That crystallizes into a very targeted form of political party, at least in the early days. So we can use our resources very strategically. And from that, and out of those tensions and contradictions, we sort of work those out democratically through debate and discussion. Some people give a little bit. We win people over through class consciousness towards our politics. They win some of the socialists over to their politics of internationalism through discussion and debate. And through that, you have something crystallized into something. And we retrench labor and retrench the political power structure in the political sphere of the state. I think that's what it'll take. I mean, I think you see some of those glimmers, I think, in Tower Hamlets. People often look at Tower Hamlets and they'll say, there's other examples like the Preston model. Preston's great. Like, I think some of the stuff they're doing is really great, but they're not really necessarily contending with some of the questions of internationalism that that they have to be essential to our organizing. It's not marginal. You can't use examples from other places. This is a country that is, second fiddle to imperialism. I mean, it is a driver of global imperialism.
Exactly.
And so I think that I think socialists have much more to learn from the internationalists than the other way around. I mean, internationalists who are like, okay, we want to fight around this stuff, you'll generally be able to win them over. People who are like, from immigrant communities generally are very left wing on all these questions. I'm making a generalization here, but generally, yes. So I think that's what it'll take. I think we have to seize the moment right now and really make that happen.
Ashok, I can see that this might be the first of other little shows we might do between us, because I think you've got a lot to say. And I think the situation that's ongoing now in terms of these pop-ups, they're almost pop-ups of hope, of kind of political independence from this awful dead corpse of the Labour Party, is beginning to feel like an actual possibility as we run into the general election. So I hope you'll come on and be cross-examined by us again.
Totally, I really enjoyed it. And I will just say this on the building of infrastructure. I've been trying to say this from day one. It's like the idea of political party, what the Labour Party and what political parties teach people really is the ability to organize campaigns around elections.
Yeah.
And what the left, who aren't used to elections, and I think is that it's somehow people get excited and all of a sudden you do some social media posts, and no, it's the graft of knocking on doors every day for 6 hours, 12 hours on weekends, building a volunteer base, getting those volunteer bases out, building a list. That's how we won in Tower Hamlets. If you win in the way you win Tower Hamlets is you build a targeted list and you knock on those doors 5 times minimum.
Yeah.
You knock on every one of those doors 5 times. That's what it's going to take to win seats in other places. But also politics is a spectator sport here. You don't think elections aren't the end of it all. We contest elections primarily because it's the means by which people engage in politics. Yeah. And then we use that as a kind of way to pry people's consciousness open. And I just think that's the way that it should be seen. It should be seen as a mechanism to radicalize people and to build infrastructure. Yeah. And it's not going to just happen. It has to. We make the road by walking.
And I love that. I'm going to have that as the last message, really. The fact that we have what we have to do, and it is the kind of work of our politics, is that we have to build lists and knock on the doors at least 5 times and actually get to know our people. And if we are at this point of struggle, and if we are at this point in terms of the Labour Party, and we want to actually sort of insert ourselves in there, that's what we're going to have to do. Because all these independent parties in these situations, they haven't got a big you know, media exposure. What they have is the community, and that's where we've got to be at.
100%.
Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.